All right. Well, if you are tuning into this live stream now, I just want to say a huge thank you for joining us for these QC Conversations, a brand new series that we're launching. If you're unfamiliar at all with our channel here at Questioning Christianity, our real heartbeat is trying to connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. And the goal with these conversations is to really help find people that know what they're talking about when it comes to areas of questions that people are sending in, whether through our website or through the social media accounts. And so we're going to be running these monthly. So if you've got all kinds of questions that you're wondering about, feel free to jump on the website at questioningchristianity.com or sign up to our socials, which will come up underneath in the show notes. And that's a way that you can start to ask the questions about God, about Jesus, and how that fits into your life, so that when we plan for these sort of gatherings, we can bring on fantastic guests. And given that QC is based here in Australia, the most recent statistics that we have in terms of people's biggest barriers to belief in God, the things that stop people from seeing Christianity as a live option or stop even considering the Christian story for themselves, number one, and by a huge margin, has to do with the perceptions around what Christians believe on sex and sexuality and on gender. And so with these thoughts in mind, I am delighted to be able to invite on Sam Allberry as our first guest for these QC Conversations. Sam is a dear friend, and he's joining us now all the way from the UK. So Sam, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me. I should say good day, mate, or something, probably. But, yeah, good to see you.
Well, I'm sure there's going to be many ways in which this interview will take the language that you love and flush it down the toilet. So if you need to correct me on my grammar or on my language, feel free to do that at any point. Now, for any of our listeners that may not be aware of Sam Allberry or may never come into contact with who he is or what kind of his role, he is an Anglican minister or a minister in the Church of England. He is a prolific speaker. People really enjoy being able to hear what he has to say with a real compassionate and meaningful tone. And he's also quite an accomplished author. So if you jump onto his website, which we'll put down in the show notes, you'll find that he's written quite a number of books in the area, particularly of the church. And why would you even bother with the church? Areas of singleness, with so much of our population today, people now in finding themselves single, whether for life or get married, divorced, or widowed. And so this huge question around how do we navigate a world now where singleness is probably what the majority of people will spend the majority of their life experiencing. And then questions around sexuality. And he's just now about to release a brand new book called What God Has to Say About Our Bodies, which is due out on August 3rd. And so super excited to be able to have Sam here to be able to throw all of these big questions that you've sent into us sort of his way and to get his feedback on. But Sam is actually a good friend of mine. And so a little bit of background. I took Frodo's advice that it's always good to have a Sam in your life. And some of my memories of Sam, some of the favorite things, if you want to get to know a little bit more about his backstory, have just been to have fun adventures around the world, doing some sightseeing, to be able to hear him speak in a whole number of ways and just see the wisdom that he has to be able to impart there. But Sam also really likes food. And so if you want to win your way into Sam's heart, there are a certain number of foods which I'm sure he'll be able to share with you as you get an opportunity to pepper him with questions perhaps in the future too. And just for the sake of kind of everyone watching, I just mean this from the bottom of my heart. I have deeply appreciated the influence that Sam has had on my life. And so I couldn't commend what he has to say enough to you if you want to be able to go and check that out in different platforms. He really does offer a compassionate tone in what he has to say and marries that together with a person-centric response. And so, Sam, I'm not trying to give you a big head too much, but I really just am hopefully opening up our listeners to say, man, you really want to listen in for the next little while to see what he has to say. So our goal for the next 45, 50 minutes is really to try and dive into as much of the content of Sam's books in response to the key questions that you have sent in around gender, sexuality, singleness, and the like. And so we might just jump in if we can, Sam, with a little bit of get to know you so that our listeners can learn some more. Tell us, what did you really think about God and religion growing up?
Yeah, again, it's a joy and a privilege to be with you. Yeah, I went back and forth growing up as to whether or not I believed in God. For most of the time, I probably did, but in a very vague, not particularly intellectually rigorous kind of way. I just sort of thought there's probably something out there, but I wouldn't want to be too certain about what that something is. Then in my kind of teen years, swung a little bit more towards atheism. Again, not having particularly thought at any great length about it, it just sort of seemed like the thing I wanted to believe at that point. So I didn't think deeply or rigorously about these things growing up, but I did think about them. We never really went to church when I was growing up, so I wasn't exposed to religion a huge amount. There was the occasional thing at school that was, would be they'd have a Christmas service or something, or I'd go to a wedding and a church or a funeral, but really wasn't affected by religion in any meaningful way.
What kind of led you then, given that background, to come to the point where you did embrace the Christian story or did decide to start following Jesus?
Yeah, it was really through friendship. So I had, when I was 16, 17, I was working in a local coffee shop at weekends, had a couple of friends there who were Christian and who were very dear friends. And a couple of times they invited me to their church's youth ministry, and normally in the thick of studies, I didn't have much time. But as my schooling came to a close and I had a bit more time, I decided to go along, really because I thought they're good friends. I want to find out more about what makes them tick. I wasn't thinking I want to go out and, figure out where I stand with Christianity. I just thought it will do me good to find out more about what they're into, so that I can honor them as friends. So it wasn't meant to be anything more than a sort of arm's length, visit to their youth ministry. It is very hard to keep the message of Jesus at arm's length, even for an evening, I discovered. So I went to their youth ministry. There was a talk on the message of Jesus. I very quickly realized that what I had imagined the message of Jesus to be wasn't, because what I was hearing just seemed new and different to me. I'd always assumed Christianity was about God, congratulating good people.
Sure.
What I was hearing in the message of Jesus was that God came into this world to find lost people. And I suddenly realized, okay, I didn't know that was what it was about. And also at the very same moment began to have this inkling deep in my heart that I might be one of those lost people. And that wasn't an obvious thing to think, because I was a pretty well-behaved teenager. I didn't drink, I didn't smoke, I wasn't kind of going off the rails in any obvious way. But it suddenly occurred to me that if there was a God and he had made me, I didn't know him and probably was meant to. And I figured that was probably on me. And that alone was enough to make me think, oh, well, I guess that would put me in the category of someone who needs to be found by God. So actually started going the next few weeks and hearing more about kind of Jesus on his own terms, what he had to say, his death, his resurrection, what he said those things meant and would achieve. And very quickly got to the point where I thought, okay, this is compelling. It's not easy, but it's compelling. And I remember thinking, if I'm the kind of person Jesus says I am, deep down inside, my only hope is if he's the kind of person he says he is, that he is someone who can save. And figured if he laid down his life for me, then I really can trust him. And I remember thinking, this is someone I can build a life on. So I remember this was summer, early August 1993. I remember one afternoon thinking, okay, from now on, I'm going to follow Jesus. I've no idea what that would look like or what it would entail or what he says following him will be like. I just knew I could trust him. I knew he would do a better job of running my life than I would. And given he'd already given his life for me, it seemed a no-brainer to trust him with mine.
Yeah. Wow, that's really, really powerful. Hey, And so that kind of opens up some big questions, given part of your own story. I mean, you're probably best known for writing books in the area, particularly of singleness and sort of sexuality. In fact, I've got a couple of great ones here. If people haven't seen these before, sort of a little bit of a summary on why does God care who I sleep with, and then really on the 7 myths about singleness. This is actually my favorite one that I've read so far, not because the others aren't great, they are, but just so much is kind of packed in there that brings together on the whole Christian story, why Jesus is really good news for everyone in every part of life, and just in the marriage, the family, the friendship, the singleness, the sex, the celibacy, and ultimately waiting for future hope. There's a ton of the Christian story I want to unpack with you. But I'm interested as to why you've chosen to speak into this area so specifically. I mean, you're probably aware people have the perception commonly that Christians are sex obsessed, that we're always talking about sex in public or denouncing sex in public or doing something about sex in public. And so why then play into the stereotype by teaching about sex and sexuality? Why have you really wanted to lean in and talk to these issues?
Yeah, there's a couple of reasons really. The last 15 to 20 years, I've served as a church pastor in some different contexts in different ways, and was becoming aware, particularly with the sort of the way culture was shifting around in its own thinking on these areas, but also just seeing the life of a local church. There was often a need to teach into this. People were often confused, or felt they had made a mess of things in one way or another and needed guidance, or were unsure what this part of life looks like if you're a Christian disciple, or didn't know what to make of some of the things that people outside the church were saying.
Yeah.
Weren't sure how to respond, weren't sure what to believe, I guess, in one sense. So there felt like there was a need to sort of try and bring some teaching and clarity into all of this. And then there was a slightly more personal reason, which is that I became aware as a teenager that I was attracted to guys and not attracted to girls. And this was back in a time nearly 30 years ago now, goodness, where, the culture in the Western world was much more homophobic than it is today. So this was something I felt I couldn't tell anyone about.
Sure.
So therefore was causing me no small amount of angst. And then obviously when I became a Christian, part of my discipleship was thinking, okay, how do I bring this part of life under the leadership of Jesus? What does he have for me on this? So it's been an issue which I've had to really think carefully about, just for myself, to figure out where do I go as a Christian in these matters? What do I think?
Sure.
And become convinced, and it won't surprise anyone to hear a Christian say this, that Jesus has been good news for my sexuality. Maybe not in the way people would assume, but I have not found following Jesus in this area of life to be life-sapping, but life-giving.
Wow.
Not always easy, but the other thing I've seen in the Christian life is that the Christian life as a whole for anyone is not always easy.
Yeah.
But again, I just find Jesus to be more compelling than anything else. So particularly, I think that one of the main impeti, however we say that word in plural, was particularly when in the UK, we were having a sort of national discussion around the legalization of same-sex marriage. And therefore, this issue was very much on the sort of table, and people were thinking about it. As you said, a lot of people assumed that Christianity was just going to be bad news for gay people, and I just felt a growing burden in my heart to be able to speak publicly into that conversation and to say that God's word to people in my situation is a good word and not a bad word. It may not be what we would sort of obviously have picked if we were writing the script, but I found it to be better than anything I could have come up with for myself. So those were the two main reasons: the pastoral need, and then this sort of feeling like there's a sort of personal dimension that I want to give voice to.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
All
massively.
of which is a bit ironic because I'm I've always been a pretty private person. I didn't think I would ever be
Bearing your
talking about
heart
my
before
sexual
millions of people.
feelings publicly.
Yeah.
And the other thing is,
Oh,
I like a quiet life, and speaking publicly about sexuality, whatever your position or whatever your convictions, you'll find some people on Twitter who won't appreciate everything you say. So it's
uh,
sort of been
absolutely.
a surprising journey to be on, but it's it gives me many opportunities. I don't particularly get excited talking about homosexuality, but I do love talking about Jesus. And for me,
Yeah,
that
I've noticed.
I can't talk about the one without talking about the other. So I'm happy to
I
do that.
appreciate that massively in the way that you do it. And obviously, people can pick up your books or watch some more of your talks online to get a longhand version of some of this stuff. But I want to dig into a couple of things that you just said. I've been with you in a couple of interesting contexts. We were together in Seoul, in South Korea, when you were speaking a little bit into some of these questions and had a bottle of water thrown at you from the back of the stadium because someone was sort of misunderstanding what you were saying. I've seen other contexts where you've been harassed and harangued, not from people outside the Christian story, but from people within Christianity. And so it seems to be on the outside. You've got people that have protested some of your events from LGBT communities that are worried that what you're bringing is harmful. And so I really wanted to dig into some of the statements that you've made to try and help tease out, because I think there'd be a lot of people listening and they're assuming your answers to a whole lot of questions. And I think some of them would be surprising. As you said, Jesus is more surprising and compelling than kind of what you first expected. So let's just say, from your experience of talking with people from more of a secular background, what do people outside of the Christian faith seem to get wrong about what Christianity teaches when it comes to sexuality and relationships? What are some of the misconceptions that you find are really common?
Yeah, and in one sense, it's a tricky question to answer, because sometimes the misconceptions have been, driven by Christians saying and doing
Yeah.
things that I think are unchristian. So one of the misconceptions might be that Christians hate gay people. Um, Christians shouldn't hate gay people, but
Yeah.
sadly there are some Christians, I think, who do. Um, so in that sense, it's an understandable misconception. But I think probably the most significant one would be that the Christian teaching on sexual ethics is harmful,
Mm.
and especially harmful to young LGBTQ folks among us as well. So that's probably the single biggest objection. It's the most urgent one, and understandably so, that I've come across. And again, that was partly why I wanted to try to speak into this conversation as a Christian from within this sort of area of sexuality, because that's just not been my experience.
Yeah. Well, if we could
Now,
for
I
a
think
second,
there are.
like let's imagine, you're back to your 15, 16-year-old self as you're starting to experience these kinds of feelings, and you're beginning to hear a little bit about God and the Christian story, and you're kind of wondering, how does God feel towards me, given my sexual feelings? What does that mean for me? So imagine someone your age is now watching this live stream and asking those sorts of questions, thinking, is the Christian story harmful? Does what God have to say, does that represent bad news for me and my sexuality? What message would you want to give? What are the things that you've really uncovered over your experience of diving into this question that have changed your mind on seeing Jesus really is offering good news?
Yeah, I think probably the starting point that is often most helpful is to say that what Jesus says about sexuality challenges every single human being. He doesn't actually single out gay people at any point in his teaching. He does have some really humbling and convicting, difficult things to say to every single one of us.
Mm.
So there's a sense in which Jesus says all of us are broken in this area of life. All of us have hearts that are disordered and confused and sort of misfiring and all kinds of things, that our passions are not straightforward and not always healthy, not always to be followed. And I'm not saying that to LGBTQ people. I'm saying that to every person.
To the human race. Yeah.
So yeah. So his teachings are that general and that sort of universal for us, and it's because all of us instinctively misunderstand and misuse human sexuality. We make it about something that broadly speaking, is there to satisfy us, whereas in the biblical vision for human sexuality is given as a means to serve others and ultimately to point in some unexpected and beautiful ways to the love of God shown us in Jesus. So I'd want 15-year-old Sam to know that whatever difficult things Christianity might have to say to him, they're difficult because Christianity is difficult for everyone. Jesus says to all of us that to be a disciple means to deny self and take up our cross and follow him. And that is difficult. We live in a culture that really esteems self-expression, and therefore self-denial intrinsically feels harmful. But so I'd want the teenage me to know that, ironically, paradoxically, and yet amazingly, it's as you come to know the Jesus who created you that you actually become the real you. We don't have access to the real us on ourselves. We can't figure that out. We try to, we grasp at things, we take certain intuitions and sort of make those the focus of our identity, but we can't truly figure that out unless we come to the one who had the idea of us in the first place. So I've really been thinking through that, when we think about God creating us, we don't just mean God happened to be the one who took the flat pack, kit and assembled us.
Hopefully
What
with
we're
less
saying is,
frustration than an IKEA thing.
no Allen keys necessary. What we're saying is, and this is what Jesus is saying, is that God thought us up in the first place, and therefore that nothing will be more life-giving ultimately than knowing the one who had the idea of you in the first place and thought you up. So yeah, it will be difficult. It means saying no to any number of very, very cherished desires, which again is the case for everyone. And yet you find doing that actually to be life-giving over time and not life-depleting. Jesus also says, if you try to save your life, you'll lose it. So if you try to grasp onto your agenda, your ideas of what will make life full and complete, you'll botch it up and make a mess of it. But if you lose your life for him, which means giving it over to him, you will gain it. So it doesn't look easy, and sometimes for our precious LGBT friends, it looks unusually cruel to them. And partly that's because Christians have not done a very good job of explaining the good news to LGBT folks. And also it's because we've not been very good at articulating the cost of discipleship for everyone.
Yeah.
So when we then see that cost of discipleship in sharp relief in particular instances, it suddenly seems cruel and unusual, whereas actually it's what Jesus demands of all of us.
And there's an interesting invitation on a reframing of, you talked about marriage, that marriage actually points beyond itself to the gospel, the marriage between heaven and earth, where God is coming for his people. And even the nature that sex and marriage, in humanly speaking, I've heard you use the phrase before that they're the trailer. I mean, both of us are big film buffs, but they're just the trailer now for what is coming, the feature film yet to be released when Jesus returns. And you don't go back and watch the trailer after you've seen the movie. And so they point beyond themselves. But our culture seems to put a really high value on these as the means to ultimate fulfillment, that you find your fulfillment, your satisfaction, everything that you're after in the arms of another person, and therefore live happily ever after. If we could pivot maybe a little bit, I'd love to get some perspective just on, I asked before, what do you see perhaps people from a secular culture get wrong about the Christian story? What do you see Christians really getting wrong in how they speak about sexuality and how they particularly build relationships with LGBT people?
Yeah, I think there are many things we could say on that. One is that, as I sort of touched on earlier, Christians have not always, I think, reflected a biblical kind of balance and proportion when speaking about these issues. So I still see many Christians who will make more of a, a deal out of um, things like homosexuality than they will out of other forms of sexual expression that the Bible prohibits that might even be closer to home to them. Um, so I've seen churches where, sex outside of marriage is kind of winked through, but where, being gay is regularly condemned from the pulpit. So there's a lack of consistency we do need to come to terms with and recognize. It's easier to be, more conscious of someone else's brokenness than your own. And I think part of authentic Christianity is that you're always more aware of your own failings than those of other people.
Yeah.
So
The
that
log
would
in
be
your
one
own
thing.
eye.
I think. Yeah, exactly. Yes, to call it, someone should write that down. That's good. So I think another thing is sometimes Christians can either treat gay colleagues, neighbours, friends as projects or as threats, um, and not just as regular people. And all the sort of normal common sense about how you do friendship and be neighbourly and just a decent human being sometimes goes out of the window for some Christians, when it comes to LGBT folks.
Yeah.
So I think that's another thing. Not every LGBT person out there is an activist. Most people just want a quiet life, and some will feel, maybe nervous about being around a Christian because they may think the Christian is out to get them in some way or is against them. So I think Christians don't always appreciate that. They sort of feel as though, well, no, the gay person is the threat, and therefore, you might be on high alert or something when you're around them. Whereas actually, in my experience, it's more likely to be the other way around. That I've had conversations that have broken my heart because the conversation has made me think, okay, this person is genuinely fearful of me simply because they know I'm a Christian, and that should not be the case. We should be the safest people around for others to open up to and share anything with. So I think we've got a bit more work to do on that front.
No, that's really, really helpful. And part of what maybe I've appreciated just reading your books and hearing you speak and having conversations over time has been just use that word proportion, the proportion that the Christian story really brings. So marriage and sex can be a good gift, but it's not ultimate. In one way, it reveals the gospel, but so too does singleness. There is a sufficiency to having a relationship with God, that God really is meaningful and enough and bring joy in our lives. And particularly, it also helps to re-emphasize other kinds of relationships, that intimacy isn't always just located within a romantic relationship, but there can be all kinds of richer relationships that we're invited into as part of God's family. And so if we could pivot a little bit to kind of the singleness aspect, it's been said that the majority of people alive today from the younger generations will spend the majority of their life single. So whether because of dropping marriage rates, whether because of numbers of divorces that are increasing, even just widowing, you may be married for 50 years, but if someone lives to be 101, they spend the majority of their life single. And so just coming to grapple then with a social fabric that's broader, what does the Christian story say about singleness? Is it a curse that you're missing out on something that is necessary for living a flourishing life? Is it something that should be pursued because of freedom and not tied down to the restraint of a ball and chain spouse or something like this? There's just so many different perspectives out there in our culture. What does the Christian story kind of speak into this arena of singleness?
Yeah, it's surprising, to be honest, what Christianity has to say on this, because it falls into neither of those kind of ways of thinking you've just mentioned. Some people will think of singleness purely in negative terms. It's the absence of romantic and sexual fulfillment, particularly if it's singleness conceived in a Christian context where you wouldn't endorse sex outside of marriage. Singleness then is seen as depriving yourself of something that is necessary for a healthy life. The Bible doesn't see it that way. The Bible sees singleness as being a good thing, but not for the reasons that I've seen some secular commentators say. I remember reading one article by a journalist who was saying the reason she loves singleness is because you get the the kind of sexual adventures, but without the sort of, the marital commitment. And she was saying, you get to do whatever you want. You're not bound to other people in the same way as if you were married. And again, that's also a very different idea to the New Testament, because the New Testament says of singleness actually what it also says of marriage, which is this is not about you. You're not
Mm.
doing this simply because you think this will be what will make your life most complete and fulfilling. In both cases, marriage and singleness are intrinsically good things that we are given in order to be of service to other people. That doesn't mean there's no sense of pleasure and joy involved, but it's simply to say that it's not the case that the whole point of being single is to satisfy your own desires for lack of commitment, or the point of
Mm.
being married is to have someone who can fulfill all of your romantic needs and make you feel complete. Um, so the Bible's surprising on both of these areas. And my observation has been that anytime we misunderstand singleness, it's most likely because we've also misunderstood marriage, and
Mm.
we've made either romantic fulfillment the be all and end all, in which case we've over expected what marriage can deliver and under expected what singleness can deliver, or because we value sexual fulfillment or something. So the Bible's just interesting on that, because singleness is actually commended by Jesus as a wonderful way of serving the kingdom of God, and
Yeah.
also anticipating something of what the kingdom of God will ultimately be about. He says, in the age to come, there will be no marrying and being given in marriage, because we will have the ultimate reality that human marriage now is meant to be that trailer for. And in that context, Jesus intriguingly calls himself the bridegroom. So again, there's you sort of we have our categories for how we think of Jesus, whether we're Christians or not. For most of us, bridegroom isn't probably isn't probably part of that, but it's one of the ways Jesus describes who he is, that again speaks powerfully to what he's claiming he can be for us and to do for us. And that has then implications for how we think about marriage and singleness in a way that dignifies both whilst protecting us from idolizing either.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really helpful sort of breakdown of putting it in its right place, that proportionality, and it produces communities that are much more healthy when we get that balance right. And I'm kind of interested then, in what ways for you has the church, this strange spiritual family that in many people's minds is more of a shadowy institution with a dark history. But what was Jesus intending that the church would be, both for married people, both for single people? How are we meant to understand God's family and its place in someone's life? So that if someone's watching this and wondering, okay, let's say I'm considering Jesus. Let's say maybe I think God's real, maybe the Christian story, there's some good news, but I'm really worried about this church thing. How do I fit into, why would I want to be a part of this local church? Can you feed into some of that experience from both your time as a pastor, but also just your wrestling with the Christian story and what the local church has been for you as someone who has spent a good chunk of their life so far single?
Yeah. So the short answer is Jesus talks about the church not just being a family, but being his family.
Mm.
He talks about us being his brothers and sisters. So that is meant to be not just some abstract theoretical concept that just sort of hangs in the air somewhere, but that is meant to be sort of felt at a ground level, tangible kind of way, that actually the local congregation of God's people is meant to be not even an extended family to one another, but a close family to one another. So whether you're married or single or young or old, you should be feeling deeply embedded in this rich, multifaceted sense of family. Um, and the church at its best, you know, expresses that beautifully. But sadly, it's a concept it's easy to lose sight of. We've become a bit more atomized and individualistic in the way we think about life and home and family and those sorts of things. And another way of saying this is that the church isn't just meant to be a community, it's meant to be a new kind of community.
Mm.
There's all kinds of wonderful communities around us. In the local tennis club, you may find people who deeply kind of look out for each other and help each other in times of need and crisis. But the church is not meant to be another community. It's meant to be a new kind of community where there should be a sort of depth and mutual acceptance of one another that just cannot be accounted for other than something has come down from heaven and inhabited this group of people. That there should be a commitment and a bond that transcends the various human categories of who we all bunch off with and divide against and all those sorts of things. So the church is really meant to be a sort of non-ignorable and compelling expression of what the kingdom of God is going to be like. It's a little outpost. I heard one writer say it's a bit like an embassy. That embassy is the sovereign soil of the land that it's an embassy for, and that the churches are meant to be like that, as this little sort of peculiar outcrop of a different sovereignty than the one we spend most of our time in.
It's a cool thought. Really, really cool thought. I mean, a lot of people's experience of Christians in the church hasn't often lived up to that kind of a vision, but it's healthy to know that that's Jesus' heartbeat for what the church would be and could be if it follows his voice and lives according to the script of how he's sort of composed that tune. So, well, can we pivot then just to kind of what I want to spend most of our time on, which is the theme of your new book, what God has to say about our bodies. I wish I had a hard copy, but I hear it's been caught up at the printers, out to be released on August 3rd with Crossway Publishers. I'm sure people can jump online, do pre-orders now through Amazon and all these other things, and not just to push, hey, go and get Sam's book, but things really have shifted in our culture around questions of our bodies, around questions of gender, biological sex, gender identity. There's new vocabularies that have been coming mainstream very quickly, and a lot of people are just confused. They want to be compassionate, they want to be helpful, but they just don't really know what to think in a whole lot of these areas. What really led you to write this book?
Yeah, it particularly has come out of, again, working in churches and being a pastor and just seeing the different areas of life that people wrestle with, myself included, and how many of those different things we're having to sort of try and work our way through. All of them are ultimately, well, many of them I was seeing are connected to our bodies, what our bodies mean or don't mean. And I thought if we go and think through what the Bible says about our bodies, how Jesus is good news for our bodies, that will actually get us upstream of many of the things that we find ourselves often confused about in life, in the church, and more widely today. So it felt like a bit of a gap in my own thinking, a gap in, I think, much of the teaching that goes on in the Christian world. Our Catholic friends have been much more on the ball on this and have, been more attentive to this area of life and thinking. And I really wanted just to try and write something that would help give people something of an overview of what the Bible says about our bodies. And again, it's maybe not what we would have assumed to be the case, but relentlessly, as always, good news for us.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, culturally speaking, things have been shifting really fast in this area, certainly from a perspective point, maybe quicker than conversations around sexuality, the conversations on gender, and then it's switched to how that affects all kinds of arenas in terms of social communities and formation and politics, and certainly even sports now, with the Olympics just over the horizon and many of the questions that have been raised around this. I just wonder if someone is listening in here who themselves just doesn't feel at home in their body for whatever reason. They feel very uncomfortable in their body. How does the Christian story make sense of this experience? Because there's a sort of secular, it's all kinds of different gender theories that are flying around. Many of them seem to be in conflict with each other. But from a Christian perspective, and this is what I appreciate about the scope of your book, more wanting to walk people through what is it that the Christian story says in the various unfolding scenes as to how we can get a real handle on why we all experience some degree of discomfort with the bodies that we're inhabiting.
And that's the thing. It's the gender identity issue is the most sort of obvious and kind of culturally urgent sort of aspect of that discussion, but actually it's by no means the only facet of that. It's interesting. I've been sort of thinking through this and working on it for about 5 or 6 years now. And, as things come up in conversation about what I'm working on, when I've talked about how we understand the human body and what the Bible has to say, one of the things that has really opened my eyes has been the extraordinary number of men who've shared with me some profound sense of unhappiness with their own body. That has nothing to do with gender identity, but everything to do with feeling as the body image issues. That culture's changing rapidly on that score as well. I was sharing with a friend recently that when I was, I don't know, maybe when I was a teenager or in my 20s, if you went to the supermarket and looked for sort of the men's grooming section, you'd have toothbrush, hairbrush, deodorant, and that was pretty much it. Shaving foam. That was it. Something to make yourself smell not terrible, and something to shave with, and a hairbrush, and that's sort of as far as it went.
We just use big knives in Australia, if you haven't noticed. That's not a knife.
I was about to say that, but now it's it's a big growth industry, and that is neither here nor there, other than it reflects a growing consciousness among men of how they look, in a way that doesn't seem to have been the case even 15 years ago. And with that consciousness and insecurity. So this is a really big issue. So people mustn't think, well, if you've never wrestled with gender identity, this has got nothing to do with you. Actually, more guys probably than not wrestle with some form of body image issue as well. That's a sort of very different kind of body dysphoria. And there are lots of reasons for that culturally that we can point to. We've got images of male and female beauty being put before us in culture that are increasingly unrealistic, and in some cases not real, because it may be Chris Hemsworth's face, but on someone else's body or whatever it might be. So some of these are not even realistic and attainable, but it can leave all of us feeling just a little bit worse about what we see in the mirror. So what we need to come back to is that in the Bible, our bodies are not incidental. They're not accidental either. David says in Psalm 139 that we have been fearfully and wonderfully made by God. It doesn't mean we've been perfectly made. We're not flawless. We're not physical perfect specimens. But we have been intended in our physicality by a loving creator. And that there are many aspects perhaps of our physicality that can still cause us pain. And both of those things are true at the same time. And the biblical account for that is because that everything physical in all of reality has been tainted and put out of joint and frustrated by human sin. And so that will include our bodies. It's why we have these various afflictions of the flesh. We get ill, we get sick. Some people stay ill. We have issues to do with shame and body image and gender dysphoria. And these things are hugely complex and touch each one of us in different and very personal and sensitive ways. But the answer to that isn't, well, my body is bad. We have been made by a loving creator, and the future that Jesus has claimed to bring us through his death and resurrection includes a future for our bodies, that we will one day be given renewed physical bodies as Christians believe Jesus had himself when he was raised from the dead. That his resurrection is again the sort of starting gun of what's going to happen to all of his people. So there are so many things that the Bible has to say about our bodies that can console us, reassure us, encourage us, and I hope give us great hope for the future.
Mm. And I mean, it seems to me, I mean, I heard you speak on this a couple of times in this sort of broader area, and much of the kind of response for the Christian story seems to be that when you track back to the beginning, there seems to be an embodiedness to who we are, that we're not just a soul trapped in a body, or as some secular gender authors have sort of written, a ghost in a machine, that you can just swap out the hardware for something else, that there is a psychosomatic body and soulish or mind, that connection that really is who we're designed to be. I know you're much more careful and concerned for real people, that these aren't just issues to be discussed, but these are people and their experiences that we're talking about. What makes you maybe concerned about the way that you see a lot more of the popular gender ideologies playing out in secular culture? As people say, yeah, I'm really uncomfortable in my body. I think I might be a boy trapped in a girl's body, or a girl trapped in a boy's body. I'm looking for help. And they go and find these scripts from other secular gender stories. What are you concerned about this idea that why can't we just change the body to match what I feel like I am inside? Why isn't that the answer?
Yeah, and again, these are just extraordinarily sensitive topics to think about. My greatest concern is that, well, one is an observation. It doesn't actually seem to be helping people. The rates of suicide, mental health, regret following these procedures can often be worse than they were beforehand, and that the statistics on that are really heartbreaking and very distressing. So if it was as simple as, well, let's just, do what we feel we need to do to our bodies to make them more us, the evidence doesn't seem to be suggesting that is what is leading ultimately to health and happiness. And it's interesting that even just without bringing a Christian framework to this, the main NHS centre in the UK where these things are done, the turnover of staff is enormous because people can't seem not to be able to cope with what they're doing to these people or feel like it's actually helping them. So that the medics are finding it a difficult ride to be on. It's causing them a lot of discomfort. But I think more than that, as you articulated earlier, there is something that the Bible accounts, or that we see, I think, in certain ways, which is that there is meant to be a unity between body and soul, the outer self and the inner person, if you like, where you can't fundamentally divorce the two. That our bodies are part of our identity. They're not all that we are, but they're not separate. They're not interchangeable. They do inform our sense of who we are. They're part of our calling. And simply to sort of think, well, the body doesn't matter, it's only my inner self-perception that matters, is not certainly not a biblical way of thinking. It may be a sort of intuitive way of thinking, but I don't feel we can trust our minds and intuitions to be able to make those judgment calls effectively. And ultimately, as Christians will always begin to realize, the answer is going to be found in the broken body of Jesus for all of our needs and wants in this life, and no less when it comes to issues to do with unhappiness with our bodies. There is a man who experienced ultimate bodily brokenness for us, who we're told in the New Testament, he who knew no sin became sin for us. That's the ultimate kind of body dysphoria. That's the ultimate experience of being in the wrong flesh. And that is ultimately the answer to our bodily brokenness and our own dysphoria, is what Jesus has done with his body. And so, again, we have a bodily future with Jesus that will be free of all of these afflictions, free of all of these pains, where there will be a perfect sense of matching up between our physicality and our personality, in a way that no one person truly experiences in this life. And I think that the Bible will give us good resources for managing those yearnings and some of those wounds and longings in the meantime. It doesn't sort of give us nothing to sort of help us until, the resurrection to come. So I think there's a lot there in the Bible for us to mine and to be thinking through. I've done a superficial, scratching the surface, kind of inadequate way of trying to articulate that. But these are such profoundly deep issues, and I think we're missing really extraordinary wisdom from Christian scripture that we need in our culture today. We are not making this better.
Well, I just really appreciate the way that you really want to not just go after differences of philosophies and tear down other ideas, but you're really concerned about the end result for people, the people whom God loves and have been made in his image and are wrestling with deep discomfort and pain, and even just the contribution that Christian community can make to that in terms of being an environment where people can feel that the others are there to help them bear their burdens and support them in kind of what they face. So just thank you for being kind of a voice that's spoken into that, and for giving a more personal and pastoral priority rather than just a political kind of a voice to jump onto these things. So just appreciate, I'm sure that people do listening. If you had any kind of parting words, if there was someone watching this who is unsure about what they think about God and about Jesus because they're not sure if they can trust him with their sexuality or with their discomfort in their body, what would be your parting message to a person like that?
Yeah, I would say the very cause of that understandable hesitation is ultimately going to be the very reason you should take a first or second look at Jesus, because actually no one understands our experience better than he does. So for those who are going through the pains of this world and are wondering if those pains are a reason to steer clear of Jesus, he actually understands them more than anyone else does. The New Testament says he's not unable to sympathize, and that sounds like doesn't sound like a huge statement, but actually it's because Jesus himself has experienced comprehensively the pain and the fallout of living in this world. And none of this is alien to him, which makes him, and those of us who follow Jesus can speak to this personally, it makes him an amazing savior to trust in and pray to lean on, to be known by, because there's a wisdom and a tenderness with him. Frankly, we don't find even with our closest and nearest. No one else fully understands us. Many people do to a wonderful extent, and friendships are an amazing gift. But actually, no one understands us more than Jesus, and we can trust our deepest pains to him. He says he won't break a bruised reed. He can be so very tender with the omnipotence and omniscience that he possesses. So I hope someone might be willing to give him another look.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that massively. It resonates a lot with my own experience of following Jesus, although with different challenges along the way. It's just 100% that thought of he's always surprised me with his goodness, his wisdom, and his gentleness in inviting me to come and follow him. So I appreciate that. As we shared, Sam, people can jump on the links down in the show notes to be able to find out where to get some more of this content, or can go and search and find a ton of stuff on YouTube where you've been there. Sam, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to come and let me pepper you with the kind of questions that people really are asking in these sorts of arenas. And not only do I appreciate that you model some of the spirit of questioning Christianity, which is that truth invites questioning, but also the idea that Jesus really is good news for all of life and for everyone. So just thanks for being willing to kind of share, and as a private person, bare your heart before whoever ends up watching this. So thanks so much for being with us.
No, thank you, and thanks to those who raised those questions.
Yeah, no worries. Well, thanks, Sam. Well, thanks so much for joining in with tonight's live stream. I hope you enjoyed the content. If you found this helpful and you'd like to see more from Questioning Christianity, whether from the conversations or from our short series, please do subscribe on YouTube. Click the bell for notifications and like this video. That just means more people can find this content helpful as well. Feel free as well down in the show notes to jump over to our website where you can ask your own questions for upcoming episodes of QC Conversations. Our next one is going to be in the area of suffering and in the area of where Christianity and intersects with women and their experience in history and today. Is the Christian story really good news for women? So we'd love to have you tune in for that in about a month's time. But for now, we're going to call it to a close, and I hope you've enjoyed this video.